to all those who signed up to speak in this debate on growing the rural economy, not least because of the breadth of experience and knowledge which is represented in your Lordship's House and which we're going to be drawing on today. And in doing so, I declare my interest as President of the Rural Coalition and as the Vice President of the Local Government Association. My Lords, many people dream of moving into the countryside because of the quality of life it can offer. I think of the strength of rural communities, the high levels of social capital, the way that people support one another. No wonder it's attractive. And we in the Church of England are glad to play our part in that. And we're at the heart of many of our rural communities across the country, wanting to contribute to their flourishing and thriving. Now, very often in this House, we raise problems associated with living in the countryside, rural crime, fly tipping, the lack of access to services. But today, I hope we can frame our debate in terms of the untapped potential of the rural economy and on the prosperity that it can deliver for our nation. That is, if we can get the right policies and support in place. Now, I note that His Majesty's Government has committed to make economic growth a top priority to, I quote, delivering on what matters most to working people in every corner of the UK. Well, to start with, it's good to remember that there are many working people in rural communities. Nearly 20% of the population of this country live in the countryside. Over 500,000 businesses are registered in rural areas, employing 3.8 million people. And the rural economy contributes over £315 billion a year to England alone. It's vital then that these missions not only deliver for rural communities, but enable the rural economy to play its part in helping to deliver them. Unlocking the pride and potential of every nation and region across the British Isles will not be possible if our strategies and policies are primarily focused on urban areas, on towns and cities. We need to be strategic and intentional about unlocking the potential of our rural areas too. Now, for many people, the phrase the rural economy conjures up pictures of agriculture and tourism. Farming, for example, has been dominating the news lately, and the impact of the budget on farming communities has been the subject of a great deal of controversy and debate. However, we need to be clear that the rural economy is diverse and innovative. Farming, as important as it is, and I'm the son of a farmer, is not interchangeable with rural industry. There are many other aspects to the rural economy. The recently published report commissioned by the Rural Coalition, of which I'm president, called Reigniting Rural Futures, shows that the biggest employer in rural authorities is the sector comprising of public administration, education and health, 30% of workers, compared incidentally with 33% in urban areas for that same sector. And it's significant that agricultural, mining, electricity, gas, water and waste as a sector employs just 3%. This pragmatics report shows that in the rural economy, productivity stands at just 82% of its non-rural counterpart, with a continuing downward trend in the future if we carry on with business as usual. However, if we could enable our rural economy to perform at a similar level to that of, for example, Scandinavian countries, we could be looking at an additional £19 billion in tax revenues for the public purse, not to mention the associated benefits that such prosperity could bring to the communities themselves. If we want the rural economy to grow, we need additional capacity. The government will need to recognise that there will be some additional costs associated with delivering services and projects in rural areas where sparsity of population poses so many additional challenges. There's often a lack of access to education and job opportunities, compounded by the lack of reliable and affordable public transport. When you talk to rural employers, one of the things they say is very often people want the jobs but simply can't get to them because of the difficulty of transport. There's a desperate lack of affordable housing, exacerbated by the huge number of second homes, particularly in the southwest, driving up prices and driving out young people from their rural communities. But there are too some hugely positive aspects of our rural communities. Over the years, I've been privileged to visit many rural businesses and farms in the diocese in which I serve, covering Hertfordshire and Bedfordshire. I think of my visit to an eco-tomato growing plant in East Hertfordshire, using an anaerobic digester which produces biofuel. The exhaust gases emitted by the engines are cleaned and then used in the greenhouses to support and enhance plant growth. Or I think of the very innovative groundswell festivals that I know some members of your Lordship's House have been to in Hertfordshire on regenerative farming systems. My Lords, we are absolutely at the forefront of horticultural and agricultural development across the world, and we should be proud and celebrate that. Our rural areas also have a big part to play in the transition to net zero. And there are already some outstanding examples of investment in renewable energy taking place in the countryside. In addition, some of the best examples of community ownership and cooperatives are to be found in rural communities, safeguarding a range of commercial services and with long-term survival rates. An excellent example of this is the Bathford Village Shop and Cafe in Somerset, which won an award at Plunkett's UK Rural Community Business Awards. I won't describe it, but you might want to look at it. It's an extraordinary initiative. And I welcome the government's commitment to doubling the size of the cooperative sector. Some village halls and even indeed some parish churches have been opened up in rural areas, providing spaces for free Wi-Fi, offering hubs where people working from home, which sounds a great idea when you start it, but after a few months can be very isolating, can gather together perhaps once a week for half a day to network and build support and friendship. These are just some of the wonderful innovative projects which are going on already in our rural communities. But if we're going to see more of these, there needs to be a little more early stage capacity support for initiatives, so that because they can be self-supporting, robust, and indeed in the long run, transformative. If the barriers are removed, all the signs point to rural communities being up for it. They'll realise their potential. And then there's tourism, which is a significant part of the rural economy, not least in areas such as Devon and Cornwall and in the northwest up in Cumbria, which are able to compete with some of the most attractive areas across the whole of Europe. However, to attract tourists, we can't just leave it to local tourist boards. We need a national strategy which can attract people to come here. But with so many opportunities, what are the barriers that rural areas face? Well, let me just mention briefly three of them, if I may, although there are many more. Firstly, poor broadband. As the Pragmatics report shows, only 69% of rural premises have a 4G signal indoors, compared with 90% in urban areas. It hinders homeworking, home banking, the growth of online businesses, and indeed even tourism. This will probably need different solutions to the ones which work in urban areas. And I've been involved recently in discussions, for example, where we're looking at installing 4G equipment in some of our remote village spires and towers, and being able to bounce signals up into areas which at the moment can't get decent coverage. A second barrier is access to banking services. The pandemic accelerated the movement away from cash, and with the industry keen to reduce operating costs, the way many start-up businesses and small charities use banking services no longer fits with the business drivers of today's banking industry. The transition to online banking is happening too fast for many small charities and businesses in rural areas, with little thought or support to aid the transition. Many are now operating in areas where local bank branches have disappeared. We need the convening power of central government to bring together the Department for Business and Trade, possibly the FCA, UK banks, Charity Commission, and community sector organisations to find solutions. Power and coordination is the answer in this case, rather than the large amounts of extra funding to ensure equal access to financial services. And thirdly, I'm conscious time's going on, just very briefly, obviously rural public transport is a huge issue for us, not least for young people if we want to retain them in rural areas and if we want to be able to enable workers to come and work in them. I want to make a few comments on local government funding and access to services. Organisations representing rural communities have been calling for a long time for fair funding for rural local authorities that take into account the additional costs of delivering key services in sparsely populated areas. I welcome the government's announcement that they'll be reviewing local government funding next autumn, although it's concerning to see that the Rural Services Delivery Grant has been withdrawn. I note the government's commitment to repurposing the money from this grant, which will be going back out in the form of the recovery grant, although the details are unclear. I hope the settlement will take into account the costs of service delivery in light of the withdrawal of the grant, as well as the factors of rural deprivation, which is often lost in the scale of geographical data that the government uses to calculate deprivation. Sadly, when one turns to the national or regional level, you find that the rural dimension of policy and funding is sometimes lost. If funding is targeted towards the largest areas of deprivation, they may well ignore the smaller pockets of rural deprivation, which are often hidden in the statistics, or in fact so small they're not picked up at all. Although I remember the previous rural advocate used to say if you added up all the tiny levels of rural deprivation in this country, you get a community the size of Birmingham. It's a significant issue, but often not identified. Deprivation is not the only thing that places demand on services. There's a large ageing population in rural areas, which places demand on social care. I wonder if the noble lady, the Minister, is able to commit His Majesty's Government to producing something we've long asked for, a comprehensive rural strategy. Will the Government undertake to rural-proof all legislation in the meantime? Will the Government commit to consulting with rural organisations and stakeholders when renewing the indices of deprivation next autumn so that a better interpretation of rural deprivation can be produced? My Lords, I'm aware too that the noble lady, the Minister, sits on the Child Poverty Strategy as the DEFRA representative. I wonder if she could give us any assurances that the forthcoming Child Poverty Strategy will focus on the particular challenges experienced by young people growing up in poverty in rural areas to ensure that they can thrive. My Lords, I'm hugely grateful for this opportunity to set out some of the many opportunities which we need to grasp, trying to highlight some of the barriers which we need to overcome, which I believe are not impossible at all to overcome, as we seek to grow the rural economy. And I look forward very much to hearing members of your Lordship's House bringing their considerable expertise and knowledge to bear so that we can strengthen this important part of our national life.
My Lord.
The question is that this